Over the last 5 to 10 years, the NBA has had no shortage of incredible trades. And one of my favorite things about NBA trades is that the perspective of who won or lost the deal changes dramatically over time. So I went back and picked the biggest trade every single year from 2015 to 2020, and I wanted to regrade it now in 2022. We begin by going back to 2015 in a deal in which the Suns sent Goran Dragic to the Heat in exchange for Danny Granger and 2 future first-round picks. There are other pieces of the deal here, but they're really not consequential at all. I want to begin with Phoenix. I gave them an A for this trade for one very simple reason. They basically got Mikal Bridges out of this trade. So they get the 2 first-round picks in exchange from Miami, and they use one of the picks in addition to trading Zaire Smith to move up in the draft to go to 10 and get Mikal Bridges. And you can say what you want to, obviously, about the incredible contributions of Devin Booker, Chris Paul, DeAndre Ayton to this current Suns team, but Mikal Bridges is incredibly important. He's a very good player, and I'm not sure they get him without this Dragic deal. At the time, they just wanted to make sure that they were getting value out of Dragic. He'd been there for a while, but it was clear that he wanted to move on and find a different team, and they did a really good job of that. And for Miami, I also am going to give them an A for a very simple reason. They made the finals with Goran Dragic on their roster. They went through a couple of different versions of their team as they attempted to rebuild their group after LeBron left to go back to Cleveland. And then Chris Bosh also retired, and they were just dealing with a lot of different things. But ultimately, Dragic, then later on Jimmy Butler, of course Bam, of course Tyler Hero, allowed them to build a group that was competitive over the years, that was always seemingly getting better year after year. And then ultimately, of course, they made the finals. So this is a really interesting, often forgotten win-win trade for both sides. We fast forward a year now to 2016 in a deal in which the Orlando Magic got Serge Ibaka in exchange for Ersan Ilyasova, Victor Oladipo, and Domantas Sabonis. We begin with Orlando here because I feel like we have to, and they get an F minus, an F minus times 10. It's one of the worst trades of the last 10 years, and we never really seem to talk about this one, but it's honestly incredible how little value the Magic got in return for the assets that they were sending out. Now, granted, Domantas Sabonis hadn't played yet, and Victor Oladipo was not a very good player at the time. He was fine, but he was a little bit disappointing as a former number 2 overall pick. And so we didn't really have a huge negative reaction to this at the time in terms of value for Orlando, but the biggest question mark was fit. They were bringing in Serge Ibaka into a team that had Aaron Gordon, that had Vucevic. How was all that going to work? It was just another example of them trying to put Aaron Gordon on the wing for whatever reason. And it was a disaster, not only from a fit perspective, but as we found out later, and we'll talk about later in this video, from a value perspective as well. And to make things even worse, they ended up moving him at the trade deadline to Toronto in exchange for Terrence Ross in a first-round pick that became absolutely nothing. So essentially, they traded Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis, who we're going to talk about in the next entry in this video, in exchange for Terrence Ross. Meanwhile, for Oklahoma City, this can't be anything other than an A+++++ for them. Again, we'll talk about Oladipo and Sabonis here coming up in the next entry, but regardless, to get that kind of value in exchange for Serge Ibaka, as they were trying to shift their roster around, ultimately KD ends up leaving. They have to change their roster in a way that makes sense around Russell Westbrook. They thought Victor Oladipo could do that. Sabonis had a really weird rookie year for them, where they asked him to do a ton of floor spacing and he shot a ton of threes. And so even though those players were not necessarily used correctly, specifically to this trade and then what happens down the road for them, I think they have to get an A+ for the value they get out of Serge Ibaka here. And now we move on to potentially the most interesting entry in this entire video, and that is 2017. There were 2 different trades I was trying to decide between for this year, and ultimately I chose the Paul George trade to Oklahoma City over Kyrie Irving going to Boston. Briefly on the Kyrie thing, it was obviously impactful. Kyrie goes to Boston. He ends up leaving. They lose assets in that equation. Cleveland is never the same after Kyrie leaves. There's a lot of problems with Isaiah Thomas. The pick that they end up getting in the deal doesn't turn out to be nearly as valuable as they would have hoped. But ultimately, everybody just kind of lost that one. And so it wasn't particularly interesting to talk about historically. But this deal, where the Oklahoma City Thunder get Paul George, is obviously incredibly relevant historically. And there's one thing that I want to always mention when I talk about this deal so that everybody knows and we all remember. Every single person thought this was an awful trade for Indiana at the time. And right now, it's very clearly an A+ for them. Now, granted, at the time, it was kind of inarguable that they did not get great value in exchange for Paul George. And the value they got is how those players ended up playing afterwards. But in the moment, it was not a fair trade for Indy. But it's interesting that it ends up working out for them, because if that version of Paul George back then in 2017 was available to be traded for right now, you would have gotten those two players and a ton of picks. The value of star and superstar trades has risen so dramatically since the time of that move, and it still worked out for Indiana. I gave them an A+ for this deal. Oladipo was really, really good for them, an all-NBA caliber player before he had some injury issues that he's still trying to recover from. And then Sabonis becomes an all-star as well. So you get, in exchange for a player in Paul George that was going to leave, told you he was going to leave, didn't want to be there, you get an all-NBA caliber guy and an all-star and two pillars of teams that were pretty good and pretty competitive over the next couple of seasons. That's a win. Not to mention, the thing that really puts this over the top for me right now is the fact that Indiana turned Domantas Sabonis then into Tyrese Halliburton, who I think is going to be an incredible player for them moving forward into the future. So if you just read it that way now, where the trade basically reads, they traded away Paul George for a first-round pick that they got in exchange for Karis LeVert, who they got in exchange for Victor Oladipo, I still think that it's an A+ for them given the situation they were in. And then, of course, for Oklahoma City, it's an A++ times 1,000. Everything about the next 10 years of Oklahoma City Thunder basketball is going to be related to that Paul George trade. It's an incredible circumstance for them to end up where they did, where Kawhi wants to go to LA and they end up trading Paul George for 3 times as much as he was worth at the time. You get SGA, who's going to be awesome. You get some other pieces to help you out with salary. You get all these future picks, and it's incredible for them. But interestingly, even if that never happens, even if the Paul George thing never goes down, he never goes to the Clippers, the fact that he stayed in the first place, because that was the big risk for Oklahoma City, was they didn't know if he was going to stay. They wanted to pair him with Russell Westbrook, but they weren't really sure how that was going to work. Even if they never make the George trade to LA and get all these assets, it's still a really good deal for them because they convinced Paul George to stay. And in exchange for Oladipo and Sabonis, neither of which were going to become the players that they ended up becoming in Oklahoma City, given the way that Russell Westbrook plays, that's a huge win for them, 100%. Moving on now to 2018, this one was completely out of control. It's the Kawhi Leonard trade. It's one of the few trades in league history that led directly to a title. In the deal, San Antonio sent Kawhi and Danny Green to Toronto in exchange for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a first-round pick that later became Keldon Johnson. I want to begin with Toronto here. I don't even know if it's worth grading. It's obviously an A+. It doesn't matter that Kawhi left. It would have been great if Kawhi had re-signed and they currently had him on their roster and they continue to run it back, because that 2019 team was really, really good. But it's irrelevant that he left. One, because they didn't give up an incredible amount. It's not a Lakers type situation where, yes, they get the title with Anthony Davis, but then they owe all these future picks on into 2026, which we'll talk about here later on. But regardless, even if that was the case, it's still a huge W to win a title, especially when you're a Toronto team that it's not like the Lakers. It's not like Boston. They have all these titles. To be able to win one as a Raptors franchise that has been relevant but not championship relevant this whole time is a huge win. It has to be an A++ for them. Not to mention the fact that they really didn't give up that much, which brings us to the other side for San Antonio, our first real negative grade outside of the Magic one. And I gave them a D. Quite frankly, at the time, I think everybody thought that it was an F. And for the longest time, a lot of people did think it was an F. They've ended up getting some decent value. DeMar DeRozan has turned into some draft compensation for them. Poeltl's nice. Keldon Johnson's interesting. But really, I couldn't give them an F anymore because of things we've learned about that situation since, and how difficult it was for them to be in the situation they were in, where Kawhi wasn't going to play for them. Nobody knew if he was healthy or not. He was clearly a damaged asset. It's not like you were trading peak Kawhi, peak superstar level Kawhi. And the options in terms of teams that would have been willing to step up and make a move like Toronto were very limited. So it was either do that or try and get some assets out of one of the bigger market teams in the league. And even then, they weren't really all that excited about making the Kawhi move. So ultimately, I gave them a D for the compensation they got in exchange for Kawhi Leonard that year. But ultimately, it's one of my most favorite trades to talk about because of how things have worked out for each team and the fact that it led directly to a title. One more side note, by the way, this is going to look way more interesting down the road if DeMar DeRozan continues to play over the next couple of years the way he is right now for Chicago and what could have been in San Antonio. We move on now to 2019. It is a deal that I mentioned in the last section as well. It's Anthony Davis going to the Lakers. It couldn't be any other move. We've really had an increase in crazy superstar trades over the last couple of seasons, but for this particular year, it had to be the Anthony Davis trade. I'm not going to bother reading the full details of the deal because it's just ludicrous. It's out of control. But essentially what it comes down to is Josh Hart, Lonzo Ball, Brandon Ingram, and the draft pick that ended up becoming DeAndre Hunter, plus a ton of other picks and pick swaps go to New Orleans. Now, some things get shifted around, some things moved. New Orleans has since moved some of those picks. They obviously did not select DeAndre Hunter. They moved back and got Jackson Hayes. But ultimately, that's kind of how the trade reads, is those three players in all this draft compensation. I begin with the Lakers. I give them an A grade for this trade. Now, some of you might be thinking, why is there no plus? This should be an A plus 100%. I'll get to that. But obviously, if you win a title, if you make this trade for Anthony Davis, LeBron is there, and you win the title in 2020, whatever you may think about that title, I've made some of those points in the past, it's an A. It can't be anything worse than an A. There are 29 other teams in the league that within the next couple of seasons would like to win a title, and the Lakers, as a direct result of this move, won a title. It can't be anything worse than an A. However, when you consider Anthony Davis's issues staying on the floor, especially lately, and the disappointing seasons that they've been having, especially lately, I don't think that it can be an A+, because they gave up so much. It's crazy to read this now in hindsight, because at the time it was like, well, they got Anthony Davis, nothing else matters. But in hindsight, to read all the picks, all the pick swaps going on into 2025 and 2026, and Brandon Ingram and Lonzo and Josh Hart, like Lonzo's very good. Josh Hart's a solid role player. Brandon Ingram is very, very good. DeAndre Hunter, when healthy, again, although not directly sent to New Orleans, is also very good. And all the picks and pick swaps, it's out of control. Quite frankly, I'm comfortable saying at this point that they gave up too much to get Anthony Davis, especially since it seemed like he was really committed to going to the Lakers at the end of this whole saga in the first place. But it has to be an A because of the title. Meanwhile, for New Orleans, I also gave them an A, but I couldn't go A+, even given the value, even given the compensation, because I do have to take into account in this scenario what they've done with those assets since. They've made multiple mistakes. Lonzo Ball is a perfect connective piece, especially for a young and a growing team, and they basically just let him go for nothing. I know that they got some compensation in exchange for him, but that situation didn't work out. Brandon Ingram's been really great, but also the big mishap for them was moving back in the draft. They could have just had DeAndre Hunter, who at the time it was unclear if he was worthy of being selected as high as he was ultimately going to be picked, but they could have just had him. They could have just stayed there, had DeAndre Hunter, had Brandon Ingram, had Lonzo Ball, then they would have gotten Zion potentially a year later if you're assuming the lottery odds still work out in the same way. And then boom, you've got an incredible core of all these different malleable wings and guards. And then they got Jackson Hayes, who's fine, but he's not going to be as good as DeAndre Hunter can be when fully healthy. And so there just have been mistakes made since. But in terms of the value, in terms of the situation they were in at the time where they knew AD was unhappy, they knew that he wanted to leave, it can't be anything worse than an A. Now, if they continue to screw this up and they don't get anything of real value in terms of multiple consecutive playoff appearances and things like that within this era, this grade's going to go down, but right now I'm going to give it an A. And then last up is another trade that I feel like we just forget about. It just doesn't enter our mind when we're thinking about trades that happened in 2020. And it's Chris Paul going to Phoenix. The Suns acquired Paul from the Thunder in exchange for Ty Jerome, Jalen LeCue, Kelly Oubre, Ricky Rubio, and a 2022 first-round pick. And this is an incredibly underrated trade in my opinion. And for Phoenix, I have to give them an A+. It changed everything about their franchise. We can go back and look and say that the 8-0 run in the bubble for Devin Booker and the Suns and how they really started to turn things around at that time. Obviously, that was incredibly important. But they wouldn't have built on that in nearly the same way if they didn't make the Chris Paul trade. And even at the time that they made the trade, a lot of us were very unsure about what that meant, about how good they would be. I remember projecting Phoenix to be like a 6, 7, or an 8 seed the year after they made the Chris Paul trade, because nobody could have expected them to grow and develop in the way that they have and be arguably the best team in the league this year. And that completely changed the landscape of their team and of their franchise. They're so much more respectable now. Everybody really enjoys this Phoenix team, I feel like. And it all was because of that Chris Paul trade. That was the thing that put them over the top. And they really didn't have to give up that much. And at the time, there was certainly risk when it came to Chris Paul's age, but every single team in the league would do this deal now if they could. Now for the Thunder, I'm going to give them a B+, because even though in hindsight, when you think about the value that Chris Paul adds to Phoenix, they didn't get an incredible amount of value, but that first round pick could still be something. There's some interesting pieces here. They got some draft compensation by moving someone like Kelly Oubre. And so ultimately, yeah, it's not like a Paul George level return, but given the fact that they got pick swaps to get Chris Paul when they traded Russell Westbrook, and then they got all this other stuff as well when they moved Chris Paul and kind of started doing this like veteran rehabilitation thing they've done over the last couple of seasons. This was really the first one of those. And given where Paul's value was at the time, obviously he ended up having a good season for Oklahoma City that year and recovered some of that value. I still think this is a really solid move for them, and I'm going to give them a B+. It's a borderline A as well. And that is the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like rating on it. Once again, my name is Tucker, and I'll see y'all next time.